Welcome back. This is part two of an ongoing series where I compare the Xperia 1 Mark V to the Mark 8. And this time we're going through photos, daytime and nighttime. Just a quick note on the left hand side, or rather in the header of each photo, you'll see the EXIF data. The XQDQ54 refers to the Xperia 1 Mark V, and the XQGE54 refers to the Mark 8. You have various EXIF data information such as the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and most importantly, the focal length was used. In this case, a 6.08 millimeter refers to a 24 millimeter lens. This is the actual focal length. The 24, 70, 85, all that's seen in advertising, that's just something relative to an actual full size lens, right? The actual focal length is 6 millimeters, which is the 24 millimeter sensor, main sensor. So getting right into it, the biggest difference I see between the Mark V and the Mark 8 is really just how the Mark 8 tends to be a little more saturated, a little more contrasty in the way it takes photos. You can see here in the sandy area from the volleyball uh, court, so to speak, the Mark 8 is much warmer, right? And that's going to be a general theme throughout all these photos. In addition, if you zoom in a little closer, the Mark 5 uh, does better with the shadows, slightly better, right? You can see in the background, this little building here. The dirt in front of the building is more visible than on the Mark 5, the Mark 8. I pan over to the trees. Again, the same thing. This area on the Mark 5 is a little bit brighter than what you see here on the Mark 8. And that lends itself to the theme that the Mark 8 wants to give a moodier look by having more contrast. But overall, the photos are very similar, and unless you're pixel peeping, you're not going to see much difference other than the white balance. In this next photo, we're still comparing the 24mm lens. Here you can see that the Mark V, in my opinion, did a better job with the sky. This blue is much more true to life versus what you see here in the Mark 8. The Mark 8 has a tendency to overexpose. Uh, just a quick note, all the photos I took were purely automatic mode. I made no adjustments to the exposure. I just let the phones do their thing. So the Mark V is definitely overexposed here. You can see there's some clipping in the shadow, in the clouds here. And as a result, if I zoom in, the shadow areas themselves are also a little bit brighter in this case on the Mark 8, right? On the Mark 8, the background is a little bit more viewable versus here in the Mark 5, it's very dark. Um, that's probably due to the fact that, again, the Mark 8 does overexpose slightly. But overall, uh, great photos on both. Um, the colors are very similar. Not so much warmth as in the previous photo on the Mark 8, but very similar overall in both photos. Um, not much to say here, to be honest. Here we're going to the 16mm lens, as you can see by the focal length. Now, the interesting thing here is that between the Mark 5 and the Mark 8, even though both were set to use a 16mm ultra wide, you can see that the actual focal length is different across both phones. On the Mark 5 is stated as 2.68 millimeters actual focal length versus the Mark 8 is 3.79. So the Mark 8 is actually a little bit tighter than the Mark 5. Now the Mark 8 does have a much bigger ultra wide sensor. That's probably why that is the case. But I wasn't expecting that. So something to be aware of in case you really want the widest angle possible on your ultra wide between both phones. Now, considering that the Mark 8 does have a larger ultra wide sensor, it does do better here in the shadows. If you're looking at this tree, On the Mark V, it's much darker than, or not much darker, but slightly darker than what's on the Mark 8. In addition, to my eyes, the Mark V is slightly overexposed on here in the grass area. Get it closer to that. In addition, there's much better resolve detail in the Mark 8 due to the fact that it's a bigger sensor. Color-wise, the Mark 8 is slightly more saturated, little bit warmer, but overall, unless again, I guess you're really pixel peeping, you may not really notice a difference. And this is going to hold pretty true for most of the daytime shots, where modern phones, if you give it enough light, they all take good photos. To be honest, I mean, this the Mark V is 3 years old now, and it's keeping up with the Mark 8. And in this case, especially with the ultrawide, right? The ultrawide is supposed to be much bigger in the Mark 8, but can you really tell a difference? I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell necessarily just by looking at two phones, excuse me, two photos quickly, right? And again, I'm not a pixel peeper, but so it doesn't matter to me too much. But if you really want to know, you can see the differences when you zoom in deep into these photos. Moving back to the 24mm lens, there's not much to say between these two photos, to be honest. The Mark 8 did do a better job controlling for the highlights here in the grass. The grass is much better exposed than what you see here in the Mark 5. Um, Going to the tree, the Mark 8 does a slightly better job exposing the tree trunk here, but the difference is marginal. The white balance is very similar. Looks to be slightly warmer on the Mark 5, and as you can see, the shadow detail it's better on the Mark 8, right? So overall, not much difference. If you look at these leaves, the Mark 8 is a little bit more saturated, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Very similar photos. I'd be happy with both of them, to be honest. I'm not blown away by the Mark 8's processing compared to the Mark 5 in this example. Using the zoom lenses, the Mark 5 is set to use the longest focal length, right? So in this case would be 5.2x, whereas on the Mark 8 it's set to use 5.8x. Now the Mark 8 uses in-sensor cropping, so it's not a true zoom, but it's still it's still better than the Mark 5, right? The Mark 5 has a very small telephoto sensor, and Sony tries to compensate by adding a lot of sharpening to the zoom, the telephoto photos, as you can see here in the grass. There's a lot of sharpening going on here. It looks terrible. Even with a lot of sunlight, it doesn't resolve well the grass, whereas in the Mark 8, it does do a better job because of the bigger sensor. And this is a crop. You can hear the flowers here. There's very little resolve detail here in the flowers versus the Mark 8, which does a better job. But again, pixel peeping, you're gonna notice those details. The foliage themselves at the full size look very similar. And to be honest, with the Mark 5, if you have enough sunlight, it's actually not that bad. Um, Unfortunately, that means that you can only use a telephoto uh, lens during the daytime because other than that, it quickly turns muddy and washed out and very blurry easily. So if you're going to stick with the Mark 5, you can only really use a zoom sensor, the telephoto lens, in bright conditions. And just to kind of prove that point, here we are again with the telephoto lenses on both phones. The Mark 5 didn't do a bad job, in my opinion. I feel like this is a totally usable photo. The Mark 8 has more contrast. It's not as flat, I would say, as the Mark 5. I think they're both pleasing photos. I personally prefer the Mark 8s only because there's a little bit more depth to the photo, but the Mark 5 is not a bad picture by any means. If we zoom in, you can see where the Mark 5 falters, especially in the hair details. If I zoom in, now this was using bokeh mode, so you can see that the cutoff here wasn't done well by the Mark 5. Does a slightly better job in the Mark 8, but if I zoom in close, there's loss of detail in my hair here versus here in the Mark 8, which is much better resolved, right? In terms of detail, the Mark 8 has more detail and it's a bigger sensor, and you can see that here in my ear, how this turns into mush um, on the Mark 5. It's much better resolved than the Mark 8. But overall, if you're viewing this on a cell phone, it's fine, right? The Mark 5 is fine. Is it worth spending 1,500 euros just to get that brand new telephoto? Maybe. If you do a lot of portrait shots, it definitely makes sense, especially in low light, because when low light, the Mark 8 can hang with the big boys, right? So, whereas the Mark 5 cannot whatsoever. So, if you're not a big fan of portraits, then you can probably stick with the Mark 5 and be fine with it. I personally don't do 17x, 20x, 100 times X. I don't care about that stuff. I use my portrait lens to do portraits. So yes, the Mark 8 is going to lose in the super long distance versus, let's say, a Xiaomi or a Vivo. But for the native focal lengths, I think performance great. Um, Getting back to the Mark 5, me personally, I have the Mark 5 and I love this phone. I'm not sure if it's worth the up the current sticker price of the Mark 8 just for that brand new lens. Even considering that with the comparison to the ultra wide and the main sensor, there's not that much difference. It even makes less sense for me to upgrade to the Mark 8. What do you think? Moving on to night photos, I wanted to kind of highlight how much the Mark 8 favors contrast and quote unquote moody pics. I was really shocked by how much the Mark 8 uh, tends to darken the background considerably, right? I mean, I just did a quick test by taking a photo of the phones. Uh, Here, this is the Mark 5. You can see how much better balanced the shadows are here in the background versus the Mark 8. It's two completely different photos, right? And at a certain point, it becomes down to personal preference. I tend to prefer the more balanced look, if because at the very least, I could always uh, edit it in post to make it more contrasty. Whereas if the photo's already this contrasty, trying to recover the shadow detail can be a little bit more difficult, especially if you're working on JPEGs. So I'm just pointing this out just to kind of uh, iterate how much again the Mark 8 favors these darker shadows. Continuing with the theme of this contrasty look for the Mark 8, we're here in the 24mm main camera, and again, the Mark 8 has darker shadows, right? It did better in the foreground because you can see there's slightly more resolved detail here in the floor versus the Mark 5. But looking at the highlights are slightly less overexposed here. But if you look at the background, look how dark this is. That is very dark, right? Compared to the Mark 5. And yeah, I'm not sure if I like that, to be honest. I tend to prefer a more balanced look. And then if I want to change it, I change it. But starting off this way is not, to me, isn't the right way to go. Many people talk about how much better the processing has become on the latest Xperias, but this I'm not exactly sure about, to be honest with you. The colors themselves, the color balance between both phones, very similar. Um, Maybe it's slightly a tad warmer on the Mark 8, but nothing crazy. At this point, it's gonna just come down to personal preference. The sky is more accurate on the Mark 5 precisely because it wasn't so dark as it is in the Mark 8. In real life, it matched this color better. So it seems to be that, to me anyway, that Sony is prioritizing not blowing out the highlights at the expense of making the shadows a bit darker. As you can see here, the lighting is better controlled here versus the Mark 5 where it's blown out. Here's another example of the processing the Mark 8. Clearly, the Mark 8 is not doing well in keeping the shadow detail on that bench. The Mark 5 did a much better job of retaining the details on the bench versus the Mark 8. Of course, that means that on the Mark 5, the foreground, the grassy area is slightly overexposed compared to what you see in the Mark 8. Um, the bushes themselves are underexposed in the Mark 8. And I don't know. I mean, this looks very dark in the Mark 8. It doesn't look like this didn't look like this in real life. So it's a little bit disappointing. Can it be fixed in post? Yes, but at this point, it means so many extra steps just to get the photo that you want. Um, some people like that. I can get into it sometimes too, because I like editing photos. But sometimes you just want to take a quick snap and have to think about editing because you just want to post it somewhere or just share with a friend really quickly. You don't always want to take it to the lab and work on it, right? So there there it is. So I think this comparison perfectly illustrates how the Mark 8 processes images. As you can see, the Mark 8, the foreground is completely dark, almost black. Um, in both phones, HDR was turned on, and they are both set to vivid. But at least the Mark 5 tries to raise the shadows where it can to give a slightly more balanced image. Now, it is the case that the Mark 5 looks a little more washed out because of it, but at least you can see some detail there that maybe it can be cleaned up in post. On the Mark 8, it's just completely, or almost completely black. And personally, I would be upset if this were the kind of photography I was expecting out of an 1500 euro phone, right? Now, I will say that the vivid mode in the Mark 8 tends to be is has a stronger effect than the Mark 5, and that could explain why the the shadows here in the Mark 8 are a little more crushed because it's going for that really stark contrast. Now, if that's your thing, great. But if not, you're gonna spend more time editing the photos trying to get that detail out than you would on Xperia 1 Mark 5. So something definitely to consider. And this is how Sony does their thing, and you either love it or hate it, and it's just how it is. And just to make sure that I wasn't making any mistakes, I took this shot several times, trying different focal points, seeing if the phone would meter differently. And no, Mark A consistently gave me this kind of photo with the dark shadows. So buyer beware. So this next comparison would be a showcase as to why you'd want to upgrade to the Mark 8. Clearly, the Mark 8 is doing much better overall in terms of noise, color rendition, and just general pleasantness of the photo. You can see that the Mark 8 control the highlights of the letters in the signage much better than the Mark 5. And if I'm being honest, because of this imitation of the Mark 5, at nighttime, effectively have only two rear camera lenses. I don't use a zoom at nighttime because of this. It's just that bad of a telephoto in low light situations where I had to rely on my wife's Xiaomi 15 Ultra for any kind of low light imagery from a telephoto lens. So this may be this may justify the purchase enough from the Mark 5. Definitely not from the Mark 7 because the phones are way too similar to justify that kind of purchase. Um, but if you're coming from Mark 5, this may push you over the hill. So this would be the last telephoto comparison, and the observations are pretty much the same as the previous ones. So I actually prefer the color rendition on both phones. They actually match pretty well, but the Mark 5 again is much noisier because of a smaller sensor size, and that's something that you cannot control. Even if you try to clean it up in post, you will degrade the photo uh, that much more, possibly, right? So outside of the noise, you can see that the Mark 5 also did not handle the bright lights as well. You can see here in the signage where the Mark 8 is actually readable or more readable than the Mark 5, and it just does a better job overall because of the larger sensor size. So there you have it. The Mark 8 wins in that front, and it will always win in that regard, especially in no lights. So it's a nice win for Sony in that regard in terms of finally upgrading the telephoto sensor. Although, for being honest, Sony took way too long to upgrade this sensor. I mean, they've been behind the competition for years and losing photo comparisons to other devices for this reason because they were just being very stubborn with upgrading their hardware. But I'll take what I can get, I guess. And since it's time to wrap up this video, since I've been talking way too long, here we are with the selfie cam, and the same kind of like contrasty look that Sony's going for in the main cameras is also present on the selfie cam. Here you can see in the Mark 5 that on my shades, you can actually see my eyes somewhat versus on the Mark 5, they're almost completely blacked out. So it gives a much more stark uh, vibe to the photo, which may not be your thing, but at the very least, the Mark 8 is a little bit sharper, as you can see in the trees in the car behind me. They're more focused and slightly uh, better handled on the Mark 8. So if you stuck around for this long, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to view this video. Please let me know what you think, and let's talk about it in the comments. Take care.